Yeah, so hopefully you're still with us. We know we're reaching a tipping point. But just to pick up on what Isolde just introduced and linking to Sissel's talk, I suppose, a lot of the work that we do in the studio that we run together is also very much inspired by these metabolic processes or the byproducts of metabolic processes, whether it be working with the metabolites found in our own urine samples or molecules that are produced by our bodies or other organisms that are used to frame experience. We have this interest in linking to these biological systems and processes, which means that a large part of our work is often collaborative. We do tend to work within the scientific domain a lot of the times, not necessarily with the intention of, limiting ourselves by certain methodologies, but to kind of try to experiment how that interaction can lead to hybrid spaces or processes or shapes or forms or artifacts that might be able to pose different questions. Although recently, as was observed by Oren Katz, hybrids in nature are kind of infertile, which means they have no future. So maybe we need to think about different terminologies, maybe more parasitic in the way that we infiltrate these spaces. So anyway, today we're going to talk about, like Isolde introduced, one of the projects that we're showing here, which is The Rhythm of Life, which was developed in collaboration with Leiden University and media artist Dave Young, who unfortunately could not be here. He's back in the UK. But the project started by just a fascination with the fact that the human body emits light. As I said earlier, we often develop our work within the scientific domain, but we're kind of really interested in this sort of tipping point between fact and fiction. And of course, if you think about the human body emitting light, the first thing that comes to mind is, pseudosciences, auras. So the image that you see here behind me is a Kirlian photograph, taken from experiments that were already done in the 30s and 40s by Russian scientists, where they were essentially placing objects on photographic plates and then, connecting them to currents. And then what you would see is, in this case, this almost aura-like biofield emerging as a result of that process. So this kind of photography, also called, I think, thoughtography, we found kind of inspiring. We're linking to this new research domain that our collaborators were working on, which they termed Biophotonic Research. So essentially, they were looking at biophotons, or particles of light, that every living organism or tissue emits, thought to be a sort of cell-to-cell communication, but that essentially is something that is being looked at, for example, within cancer research or the development of non-invasive diagnostic tools. So in that context, we came across, if I just mention quickly that they are within the visible light range, so in theory we should be able to, so our sensors, the sensors of our retinas, do perceive them, but we have this neural filter that prevents us from really seeing them, because otherwise there would be too much noise that we would be seeing constantly around us. So we found that kind of fascinating, specifically because we were paired with this device, which is called a photon multiplier tube, which essentially allows you to measure the emission of, in this case, the human hands. And it's just basically paired with very sensitive cameras that allow you to record the emissions that this part of your hand, the upper part of your hand, emits over a specific period of time. But of course, if you look at this, linking also to some of the talks from this morning, it's essentially a black box that you put your hands into, and essentially this should be able to measure the light that your body is giving off. And of course, different parts of your body emit different light intensities at different times of the day. So we were kind of triggered about how we could experiment with this and see, just what kind of feedback or data we could extract from this interaction with this very strange equipment. So we did a first test, and Dave, Mike, and myself stuck our hands in this device and then took some measurements. And this is some of the first recordings that we took out, which we translated into a visual visualization. So we could sort of start to engage with just the correlations between the left and the right hand. There's this idea that the more balanced your emissions are on the right hand and left hand of your body, let's say, the healthier a system is. So we were not very balanced, but
particularly me.
Particularly Mike's. If you see the visualization, you can see each one of us is split between the left and the right hand. But this was just a starting point to start to engage with essentially the data output that was coming out of this equipment. And at the time, a lot of the discussions that we were having in relation to the emission of these photons was relating to their rhythmical qualities. So the idea that not only are we emitting these light particles constantly, but there's rhythmical pulses that we're emitting them in, which means that with every individual or every biological system, they have almost like their own personalized rhythm. And so that sort of led us into looking at music as a metaphor in an attempt to try to see how we could engage with the experience of those emissions and not just visualize them, but to explore other potential, iterations of that experience and potentially even translate them into sound.
So, I think as Sue's starting to allude to, I think part of the challenge we had with the project is again, this kind of black box that you stick your hands into. Yeah, there should be some sound for this playing in the background. Well, there you go. So this is Gamelan. I'm not sure if you know what Gamelan is specifically, but it's a traditional Indonesian music. It's traditionally a kind of percussive ensemble specifically. And the idea behind this is that the music is played in a cyclical form. And this is meant to represent this idea that the Balinese particularly have about the cyclical cycle of nature, and particularly the interconnectedness between the mind, body, and the soul. So you could say that rather than cats, because that seems to be the subject of the day, Gamelan became a bit of an inspiration for us, particularly because of the healing qualities that apparently this music's supposed to have. And actually one of the analogies that the researchers had in the project is that there is a traditional Nepalese device that's used for measuring, looking for bone breaks, and it's a really highly crafted brass bowl with a kind of a hammer or a beater. And when you hit this thing and move it up and down a leg, the change in the tone would be enough to locate where the break would be. So I think we very quickly started to understand that there was maybe a necessity with a project like this to start to engage with the more kinetic or like physical audio output to start to make sense of these rhythmical pulses. And so because of that, we sought out, I think, one of the only custom cymbal producers still in Europe. He's based in Bath. Strangely, he used to be a microbiologist, but he quit to become a drummer. But in his spare time, he started making cymbals, and so we had him commissioned to make a series of cymbals for us that were effectively replicating, let's say, some of the gong-like properties from gamelan music, but also that tried to keep some of the traditional wash that you get in a regular cymbal. And these cymbals were used more or less as the center point of this installation that you see here, which we call the Rhythm of Life. So the idea with this is that the piece of scientific equipment, the PMT, is very much at the center of this. And so we have 7 cymbals around this, the idea being that by placing your hands into this black box, these rhythms of your body were being played back to you in real time, creating a kind of feedback loop of sorts. So the cymbals were produced so that they were representing essentially the left and the right hand, the correlation and the asymmetry between the two, as well as what they call Fano factor slope, which is a kind of energy loss, let's say. And so the installation was built in such a way where we were really trying to create a piece of work which was taking these sort of invisible photons and making them perceivable, making them sensible. So this really wasn't just about making it audible, it was really about making it something that you could really deeply feel. And so the installation in this particular configuration was presented for the first time at Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in 2014. And throughout the course of a 2-day weekend, 56 participants took part in actually interacting with the work, with the premise being that they were invited to experience their bodies in this quite unusual manner, but by doing so, they would be exchanging their data and giving it to scientific research. And so as you can imagine, because there was this, let's say, serious research component to the work, we were required to create consent forms within the museum. So that became a kind of interesting aspect of the work for us, particularly in starting to consider the way that we give consent to our data, particularly in this case, biological data. So aside from this as well, we collected a bunch of questions. We had a questionnaire, so I think we collected around responses for 30 different questions for each participant, and every participant had to give consent and actually answer the questions prior to having access to the equipment. So this was like a requirement, so to speak. This was very much devised as an ambiguous exchange, really. I think the reason for this, of course, is that in many respects, the ambiguity of giving the data for this purpose also very much mirrors the ambiguity of the data itself. I mean, the reason, of course, for wanting to actually create this data for scientific research is that the research is so, let's say, new, that the meaning behind this is still somewhat debated. They know that people with cancer emit higher amounts of photons. They know that people who actually meditate, have lower emissions as well, but there's still some sort of gray areas with this. And so the ambiguity in this transaction really starts to play with the notion of, they don't know what it means, we don't know what it means, and the audience really don't know what it means either. So we wanted to play on this specifically. And so over the case of these 2 days, we collected 56 data sets, and these very much form the core of the configuration of the work that you can see upstairs. And so really, when we were invited to take part in STRP, we thought, again, our projects are very much long-term. We have a bit of a rule as a studio that we don't like to show the work in the same configuration twice. So this became a way to return to those original data sets, this stored energy, as we like to call it, and think about how actually that could be looked at in greater depth. And so for STRP, what we've put together is that visitors are able to essentially select and play back these tracks publicly for the first time. Last time this was a very intimate situation, so only the individual with the equipment heard this. This is the first time where it's done to a live audience, so to speak. But in doing this, there's a bit of a catch. In kind of going upstairs to the installation, this is what it looks like. There's a touch screen. You're required to answer 8 quite basic questions. I will say that they're not recorded for those of you who are wondering, but this is effectively creating a match between you and the closest match from the 56, and then you will hear the energy of these one of these people played back to you for the next 4 or 5 minutes, as well as information given within this original questionnaire. And so the work is really, in this configuration, starting to question the way that we attribute meaning and value to data, particularly biological data, and particularly the way that technology starts to make assumptions about us, which I think in relation to, let's say, biological data in particular, and sort of self-monitoring is a very, I think, important question to be probed in further depth, particularly when we start to think about the way that this information is maybe networked and linked to other data such as social media, bank accounts, health insurance, as Tobias was mentioning this morning, etc. So yes, that's it for us at the moment. So yeah, please go upstairs and have a go.
Visit the work.